It's the late 1980s. General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, has some hard choices to make. He knows that the Stalinist and post-Stalinist economic systems in Russia are moribund. They are not working for anyone. The average housewife is spending several hours every day in line to just get a single loaf of bread, and it's lousy bread, heavily cut with sawdust. He encourages two new policies. The first is called glasnost, which means openness. A Soviet government is encouraging people to criticize things as they are, and instead of sending them away to the gulag, these critics are going to be rewarded because they're going to point out the problems in society that need fixing. Perestroika is his other policy. We're going to use the criticisms of glasnost, and we're going to restructure things so that communism can work. But the strains of paying for the Soviet military adventures in Africa and Asia, the Soviet missile systems, the Soviet space program, paying to bankroll Cuba and other communist economies that fail unless the Soviets heavily bankroll them, and now to pay for a strategic defense initiative of the Russians' own to balance the American Star Wars missile defense system. It's too much. East Germany is the best of the Eastern European satellite states that the Soviets have, and they still have the problem of the Berlin Wall. They also have, by the 1980s, a massive suicide problem. People are so depressed living under communism that they're killing themselves in large, unprecedented numbers. If the East Germans aren't happy under communism, all the rest are much less well off in the communist world. What does he do? See, traditionally, when things are bad at home, Russian leaders go on the attack. And the Russians have had a plan for a long time now to get from the Fulda Gap to the Spanish border in weeks. Not months, not years, but weeks, involving a massive attack using tactical nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, the Soviet tank armies in Central Europe, the American distance and having to cross the ocean with resources, the political divisions between left and right in the West to slow down Western responses, trying to peel France off. If France stays neutral, then they'll just take over Germany and the Low Countries. All of these things have been ready to go. The Russians have really good military equipment by the late 1980s. They're catching up in some ways to the American systems of the 70s that have been dominating things for years. That's what I was afraid would happen. Instead, on November 9th, 1989, I saw something I never thought I would see in my life. I saw the people of Berlin climbing the wall and not being shot. I saw the Stasi leaving, running away, abandoning their posts. I saw the people of Berlin tearing down bits of the wall with hammers, with sledgehammers, ripping away the barbed wire, taking away the machine guns, and joining in the dead zone, the no man's land between the beginning and end of the wall. I saw the wall come down one night in November in 1989. Gorbachev let this happen. When this was allowed to happen, the Velvet Revolution occurs throughout Eastern Europe. In Czechoslovakia, the former playwright prisoner Václav Havel becomes president. In Poland, Lech Walesa goes from being a political prisoner to being president. East Germany begins negotiating with West Germany to become a unified Germany again. In NATO, throughout the Ceausescus, who were the dictators of Romania, are found guilty by a people's court and executed as traitors to their people. They were bloody-handed dictators. Throughout the Eastern European world, communist governments are falling. In Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, the Baltic states, movements to return to independence happen. In White Russia, Belarus, movements to rebuild independence begin to take off. And throughout all of this, Gorbachev holds his fire. I was so afraid that he would launch an attack to try to hold on to power. But he didn't. And as much as Reagan deserves credit, and Thatcher and John Paul II for getting rid of the communist threat from the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev also deserves credit for not launching a final war as a desperate act of shared suicide. I'm going down, I'm taking you people with me. Of course, it wasn't all over the world. The Chinese, in June of '89, 6 months before the fall of the wall, had launched the Tiananmen Square massacre against pro-democracy movement members exactly my age, which we've talked about already. And the Chi-Coms to this day have made it clear to anyone who will listen that they would rather launch whatever weapons they have in a final fight to try to rally all Chinese around their flag than give up power peacefully like Gorbachev did. They make fun of Gorbachev. They call him a coward and a weakling. So communism in China and North Korea is not dead. Communism in Cuba is not dead. My relatives still live under communist slavery there. But Gorbachev allows the fall of the wall, and he allows the collapse of the Soviet Union. In '91, there is a brief resurgence. Gorbachev is captured in South Russia, and a new Politburo of hardcore, old-style Brezhnev-type communists tries taking over, but they fail. Ultimately, the Russian people, the people of Moscow, led by Boris Yeltsin, stop the tanks. Yeltsin's famous for standing on a tank and rallying people to free the Belodrome, the White House, which is the parliament's building in Moscow. They have a White House too. And Russia is reborn. The Soviet Union dies in 1992, and the Russian Federation is reconstructed in 1994. Its first leader is a weak fellow named Boris Yeltsin. He liked his drink too much, and unfortunately, under his reign, the Russian mafia ended up getting great power, and so did the nomenklatura apparatchiks. The people who had bureaucratic titles under the old system ended up raiding the Russian economy and becoming crime lords themselves. And the current leader of Russia, Vladimir Putin, is one of these gangsters who ended up having the power through his old KGB cronies. He was a KGB colonel before the end, to overthrow Yeltsin and become president, so far anyway, for life. And he wants to bring back the glory days of Stalin. Not so much in terms of the purges, but in terms of the world fearing and respecting Russian power. Putin's a threat to Western Europe, and there's a reason why NATO has expanded eastward to include Poland and the Baltic states and others, because we don't want the Russians in Western Europe. The Cold War, from beginning to end in 1 week. Next week's our last week. You'll have the final and a few more videos. Thank you for your attention.